Hey YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. Today we are going to do Why You Love It So Much, Episode 2, the Marshall JCM-800. Without any further ado, let's check it out. So here we're looking at the schematic for probably I'm going to call it the grandfather of high gain amplification. While that might be a little bit of a stretch, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that if it wasn't for this amp, many of the amps that we, are more sought after these days probably wouldn't exist. I'm going to ramble off a few just to give you an idea. We've got Soldano, we've got Friedman, we've got Bogner, we've got Ignator, we've got Spawn, we've got Top Hat, Cornford, just an endless number of, amplifier companies that have made an amp that in one way or another is very much an homage to this guy right here, the JCM-800. Wow, excuse me. I'm gonna let you guys in on a little fact. I just went through the stats the other day. 100% of my fan base, not my fan base, I'm not a fan, I don't have any fans, but 100% of my subscriber base is guys, dudes. 100%, dude, we are rolling in a 100% sausage fest over here. Just saying. Anyway, enough with that. So sorry, I had to burp. It's a little crass, a little rude, but let's be fun. Let's have fun. Anyway, obviously there's some other amplifiers that around that time started making high gain options. Mesa probably was the grandfather, the next grandfather, I guess, in line, you could call it. They kind of had their own idea of how to get there. And then, PV kind of took a lead in another direction with that, even still yet. And then you have companies like Engel, there's Diamond, Rev, Crank, and several others that kind of, their own little way of getting there. But in terms of who started it, it's really kind of Marshall, and the JCM-800 is really the one where it picked off at. So let's go through and, you know what? First, just in case you forgot what one looked like and sounded like, let's check that out. All right, now that we know what one looks like and sounds like, if you've forgotten, which I can't imagine you would have, let's go through. We're going to check out the signal flow first before we really get into the meat and potatoes of why you love it so much. We're going to start at by the way, don't laugh at my PowerPoint work here. I had to do all of this work here in PowerPoint, so the tools aren't great. I don't have the kind of time to really spend with it elsewhere. I couldn't get ChatGPT to do it for me, so just don't laugh at it, all right? It is what it is. So we're going to start at the high input. It's going to go in through this unmiraculous first preamp stage. There's nothing crazy about this stage here. It's pretty typical, right? We're going to go up through what I'm going to call, we're going to take a little segue here, what I'm going to call probably the most standard value to go with. If you're ever in doubt, if you're designing a guitar amplifier and you're not sure what value to go with for a coupling capacitor, start with a 0.022. For those of you on the other side of the pond, that's 22N. I'm in America, so we call it UF. Anyway, I'm kidding. I'm not, don't take me seriously. I apologize if I offended you. I really do. Anyway, so 0.022 UF is like literally like the middle of the road coupling capacitor to go with. So if you're ever in doubt, start there, and then if you need more balls, go lower or higher in value, so 0.047 or something like that, or 47N. And if you need less balls, if you need it to be a little more mid-rangey or mid-range, biased, go with something like a 0.01 or something like that. But in either case, moving on, it goes through a 0.022 UF coupling capacitor, and then it actually goes through the low input jack. If you run into issues with signal continuity, on the input side of your guitar amplifier, if you got a JCM-800, this might be a reason why sometimes you got to clean those connections up. The low input, I'm going to say, is probably one of the more ignored inputs on the JCM. If those connections start getting corroded and whatnot, it can cause intermittent issues there. So from there, it goes through this voltage divider network that has a couple of bright caps sailing over the top of it. This helps get the grit level up just a little bit, helps make the high mids kind of poke out a little bit and give it some of that aggressiveness that we know this amp for. There's more to talk about this later, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. Then we get kind of into the thing that really kind of sets this amp apart from all the other ones prior to it. And that's the cold clipper stage. Now, it's not the first amp to do it, certainly not the last amp, but it's the first one to do it in kind of the way that it did. Basically, what they did with this stage here is they biased it to be a little bit colder than it should be, and that helps it get some asymmetric distortion. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that lends it to that nice, warm, growly, bluesy kind of overdrive, and it's pleasing to the ear. We love it, and it's a large part of why you love this amp so much. Anyway, moving on, we go into another 0.022 UF coupling capacitor, and then into this voltage divider network here that basically dumps half the voltage away. So if let's say there was 60 volts here, by the time it gets here, there'll be 30 volts. That's all it's doing, is taking half of what there is and taking it away. And again, it has another bright cap in there, and we'll talk more about that later. Then we get into this stage here, fairly unmiraculous. Again, it's just a standard gain stage that goes into a cathode follower. A large part, I'm not going to say a large part, it's not the most famous part of what gives this amp its sound, but this part here does go into overdrive, and it does have a sound, right? But its predominant purpose, this guy right here, is to drive current through this tone stack. We've talked about it in times past, but more or less all you need to know is that a cathode driven circuit has more current, and because it has more current, it has more power to drive through lossy tone stacks, which then just gives it enough snot after you open up the master volume to drive the next, or the preceding stage into distortion a little bit more. So that's all you got to know about that. Then it goes in through a fairly unmiraculous, again, I say unmiraculous a lot, but I'm just saying there's nothing crazy about it. It's not different than any other amp of the era, really. But it goes through the phase inverter here. It's a long tail pair that feeds into a pair of, in this case here, they're saying EL34s. Now, there was different versions of this amp, and when I say different versions, I mean that they'd had different types of output tubes for, I think, either like the region that they were in or just whatever they felt like putting out that week. I think this amp was popular for using KT77s, 6550s, and EL34s. I want to say the earliest variants of this amp actually went out of the shop with 6550s, which are more akin to kind of like a 6L6, an American-made 6L6 or something like that. It has more of that kind of thing going for it. And then, of course, they had KT77s, which are kinkless tetrodes. 77. It's, again, all kinds of tube history there. And then EL34s, of course, were the ones that everybody kind of, thinks of this amp as having. I think that was more or less what they settled on in the end when they kind of standardized it a little bit more. But there are several different variants. that have different tubes in them. I think all of the 100 watt versions, which I believe is the 2203 model off the top of my head, if I'm correct, I think all of the 100 watt versions came with EL34s in them. The 50 watt versions were the ones that they played around a little bit more, but the 50 watt versions were the first ones to really come out. So there is that. Not exactly the reason you love the amp so much, but it is a big part of the sound of the 800 as a series is the EL34s, I would say. The EL34s kind of had more of a barky mid-range to them. They broke up a little bit differently than the 6L6s, maybe not as smooth and round and glassy, but just, you know, a little more ballsy, I guess, in a way. You know, they had more of that grunt to them, the EL34s that is, and they had more of a bark to them, which I think some people like. So going on from there, kind of other things that you love about this amp so much is kind of the present circuit. You can play around with that a little bit, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if it wasn't for the present circuit in this amplifier, you probably wouldn't like it so much. I would dare say that, you know, some of the other amp models, like the JTM45 in particular, if you were to lop out the present circuit, you could probably tolerate the way that amp sounded. With this amp, if you were to remove the present circuit, you would not enjoy this amp. It would not be the JCM-800 that you know and love. So that is a big part of, you know, the thing that you love about this amp is the present circuit. So don't veer too far off the beaten course with that one. Another part of why you love this amp so much is the power supply section. They're really kind of the first to just take it on and just over filter it to high hell. They're going in through a solid state rectifier, which they're not the first to do it, but that's not really the point. They go through 100 UF here. They took 250s and they put them in parallel with each other. So you got 100 UF worth of reservoir cap, which is huge. Not very standard for that time. Then they go through a choke. So again, they go into something that's already kind of stiff and definitely makes, you know, stiffens the amp up a little bit, but definitely controls ripple. And then they have a filter on either side of this, you know, dropping resistor here, 50 UF, of course, on either side of it. They go through another dropping resistor and then yet another pair of filter caps surrounding another dropping resistor. Both 50 UF. By the time you get to the first preamp stage over here, the first tube, I should say, because you got two preamp stages, but in either case, by the time you get here, you probably got 6 to 8 times more filtering than you need. This thing is uber stiff. There is no ripple over here. It's literally as flat as that line is right there. There's so much filtering in this amplifier. So that's kind of where they broke away from the other norms, is by making a very, very stiff power supply. And that helps get the amp that sense of immediacy. It helps make it more abrupt, if you will, more aggressive, very tight. So it helps reel in a lot of that low end, because they're letting a lot of low end sail through this amplifier with those .022s in there. So that's one way of controlling it, is making the power supply really, really tight, but yet still allow it to be ballsy. So that's a big part of why you love this amp as well. So let's move on a little bit and kind of, you know, get an idea of things that we can, you know, modify, I guess, if you will. Some of the popular spots that you'll see modifications done. This is one of them here. You can either get rid of this guy or you can change the value a little bit. I dare say that by the time you get up over like 3 to 5 UF, you're going to start getting into the not so fun land again. Going with 1 UF to 3 UF, you start getting into that honky range. And then once you get above 10 UF, you start getting to full bandwidth amplification out of this tube, which is to say that it's just making everything louder going over to here, so there's no point in really having it anymore. So you can play with this a little bit there. Really, I would just leave it where it's at. 1 UF is a good value, as in terms of, you know, an alternative to 680N, which is 0.68 UF. Another thing you can do, instead of going with 2K7, they went with it pretty cold here for the bias on this tube. So instead of 2K7, you can go with 820 ohm, or you can go with 1.5K. Doing that will help warm it up just a little bit, so it'll take some of the highs out, but it'll also cause it to distort a little bit more going into this stage here. Or I should say it'll drive this stage to distort a little bit more. So again, if you're trying to get a little more distortion, you can play with this value. Going lower will help increase distortion. Another thing you can play with is the plate resistors. The plate resistor, pretty standard value, 100K. You can go up to 200K or 220K or something like that. That'll, again, kind of change the feel of the amp. It kind of feels a little more, I don't know, it's like more compressed, a little more abrupt still. So, you know, if you got that staccato tightness kind of thing going, it'll kind of emphasize that idea more. A lot of high gain amplifiers start off on the first stage with like a 200K, and I believe the Soldano is popular for that. The cold clipper stage, we're going to get into that real quick, but next in line, you've got this area here that you can play around with. You've got two bright caps in a row. Now, this one here, I'm going to say is the one that you should get rid of first, only for a couple reasons. Generally, I'm going to say that if you, obviously it's not always prudent to run the master volume or the preamp gain all the way up. But you know, if you want to kind of help dial out some of the brightness at lower gain settings, getting rid of this guy here will help kind of do that. To me, I like getting rid of this one right off the bat because it just makes this a little more uniform throughout its entire range, right? So at the lowest gain settings, it's just about as bright as it is at its highest gain settings. If that isn't enough for you, then by all means, get rid of this next one in line here, or go over to this guy here. So getting rid of this guy here is kind of the same as that, but between these three bright caps here, you can kind of dial out the amount of brightness this amp has depending on how you use it the most. I would not say that you're ever going to need to cut all three of them out. Most people only end up cutting one or two of them out. And I would say that this one here and this one here are the most popular ones to do that with. But there's all kinds of different ways that you can go with that. But it's up to you, right? So take your pick. But just in case you forgot what this amp sounded like and you're tired of hearing me ramble on, let's listen to some more of this thing and gawk at it a little bit. All right, I'm sure you've seen it and heard it now. So let's move on to the next thing, and probably the biggest factor in what makes this amp, you know, work the way it does and why you love it so much, and that's the cold clipper stage. Now, a big part of what makes the cold clipper be a cold clipper is this guy right there. You can play with that value. Soldano went with 39K, and there are some other amplifiers that try to get a little more gain, and by getting more gain to do that, you would go up in or lower in value, so like 5K or something like that. I would not go below 5K, or it'll start getting really messy really quick, especially later on, because there's a lot of distortion that's going to be had by the time you start getting this by 5K. But 39K to 5K is kind of the magic zone. Now, how this works is kind of like this. If you can imagine the incoming signal here, right? This is being the center point of it. What this guy right here is doing is taking the floor and is moving it to this point right here. So this is this isn't a very good representation, but it's giving you the idea that the bottom half of the signal is running through the floor of the amplification factor of this tube right here, right? So the lowest signal that it will amplify is now at this point because of that value. So if you go with a 5, it's actually going to move this up here more. So more of that, excuse me, wrong way. It'll move it down here more. So more signal will get amplified out of this tube, which will drive this side higher, drive this side more into distortion, and then reduce the amount of asymmetric distortion that you're getting, but still have a asymmetric distortion. That's what you got to keep in mind. So the lower this value, the lower down this way it goes. The higher this value, the further up towards 0 it goes here. So 39K, let's say just imaginary line, it's going to be right in there, okay? So what that looks like when we hear it is this. So again, you can kind of see here the way the bias is shifted. We got more on the positive side than we do on the negative side. And with our 0 point, this is being our floor here, what we end up with is an unaltered top half of this signal, but the bottom half ends up being clipped. And so that's the asymmetric distortion that I speak about. It's nice and warm. It's smooth. We like it because it's bluesy. It's got this niceness to it. It's pleasing to the ear. And it's a big part of why you love this amp so much. So that's how that works. Rob Robinette has some stuff about this on his page, but basically I would keep it at 10K. Maybe you can go up to 20K. 39K, I think by the time you get that high, you're out of control. You're not going anywhere anymore. So the next kind of spot that you can play around with, a lot of them will do this, you'll see it a lot, is they'll put a bypass capacitor on this guy right here. Doing so will add a bit of gain, obviously, to the whole of this, the remainder of the circuit here. Same kind of values as this first one here. By the time you start going up past 10 UF on this part here, it'll start getting too woolly. It'll really start sounding fuzzy and almost like a zipper. You won't like it that much. Again, it'll be honkier when you kind of hit those mid-range things. So like 3 to 5 UF, it'll start getting a little honky sounding. So you're kind of relegated to either going full bandwidth, so you're letting it get fuzzy and all that jazz, or you're kind of sticking to something like 0.68 UF, excuse me, which it'll just make it the upper mid-range bark and bite that you're used to again. 1 UF is another popular value to put there. So play with that a little bit, but there's not a whole lot that you can do here, but that is one way to get a little more gain. The cathode follower, some people say it's the first tube in this particular circuit to go into distortion. I don't know about that. There's a lot of gain going through this guy, but it does interact with the whole of this circuit to help smooth it out some of the grit. A big part of what makes this amp sound the way it does is this cathode follower. I am not a fan of cathode followers. They have a sound to them, and I'm not a fan. What is great about them, though, is they do help drive through these lossy tone stacks. So Fender, Marshall, and Vox have these tone stacks like this that they're famous for, and they suck a lot of gain out of a stage. And a cathode follower is a good way to help push through that, to get through the master volume, and then to drive the phase inverter into distortion itself. So that's where we're going from that point on. And there's a little bit you can do with the phase inverter as well. So, but first of all, let's talk about this guy right here. So this is the slope resistor that we're looking at here. And what this does is it kind of sets the 0 point, if you will, for the tone stack. It kind of sets the low cutoff point, if you will, in this instance. There's a link that I'll put down in the doobly-doo for the Duncan Tone Stack Calculator. It's a great tool if you want to know how to play with some of these, or if you want to play with some of these values and kind of find some values that work for you. But more or less, the lower in value that you go, the more bass that you have. It kind of shifts the bias of the whole tone stack towards the bassier side. And the higher you go, so 100K, 150K, if you go that high, it'll bias the tone stack more to the mid frequencies, or higher frequencies, if you will. So that's part of why you love this amp so much. Is it's pretty much as low as you practically want to go for this particular amplifier. It allows it to still be ballsy and have a lot of the low end, snot that you like without getting out of control. So if you have a little too much woolliness or too much roundness down in the lower end, if you want to brighten it up a little bit or stiffen up the low end, you can go with a higher value, 56K or 100K or something like that. So next, we've got the phase inverter. Now, the phase inverter is getting spanked pretty hard by the time you've got all of these guys working here and you got the master volume all the way up. A lot of people discredit how much contribution the phase inverter has to the core sound of JCM or any amp really in particular. When you drive a long-tail pair into distortion, it has a sound, and it is a big part of the sound of the amp. Not to discredit it, but it's not obviously any amp that has 2 tubes in it's going to have a phase inverter. So I can't say that it's particular only to JCM-800. It's just don't discredit that as being a thing. There are ways to play with this a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video, but one spot that you can play with is right here at the plates of the phase inverter. There's a ice pick cap that they call it here. Usually it's a pretty low value. Sometimes it'll be up as high as 100 picofarads, but 47p seems to be the standard value for a lot of these amps. All it does is get rid of the highest of highs, the airiest of airs, if you will. So if you darken the amp up earlier on, and I mentioned before about getting rid of some of these bright caps here, getting rid of those bright caps will darken the amp up a little bit, which will make it where you probably will want to get rid of that guy. Maybe not, but the point being is that this is a spot that you can play with. If your amp is a little too bright, you can increase that value up to, say 100, 120 PF. By the time you get much past that, it'll probably start getting a little too woolly and dark. But that is a spot that you can play with. So let's gawk at a 1980s era JCM-800 and listen to another clip of this thing kicking some butt. All right, so this is indicative of a 1980s era. It's well made. It's obviously they've gone to PCB by this point in time. I like the layout because everything's kind of square or vertical or whatever you want to call it, perpendicular or something like that. But what's great about this era is that they still have everything mounted. All the tube sockets are chassis mounted. You can see they didn't even go through the trouble of twisting these heater leads up. So, they got away with it then. You can probably get away with it now. I think it's prudent to twist those, but it's a well-made amp for the era, I think. But you can see here, like, there's that network there that's got this is the 470, and it's got the 470 PF cap around it. This is the 470 PF that goes around the first input, the volume, the gain pot, if you will. They're just using standard old ceramic stuff there. They got another ceramic down here for this other one. So easy to clip out, easy to play with. So you can see this is how they started cheapening it up a little bit. You can even see here that they had, you know, a 4-hole version at, you know, some point. They might have just used a 1987X chassis or something like that for this. Who knows? But and they riveted in. You can see how they riveted in the tubes. My goodness, excuse me, the tube sockets even. But this is showing you how they made it back then. If you make it today, it better look like this. This I've shown before on another one of my videos. This is an amazing job right here. To the best of my knowledge, this came out of Pop Rock Shop out of New York. Amazing work. If you're gonna build an amp, it should look like this. Straight leads, like, come on. This is just immaculate. This is beautiful. I'm not a fan of multi-can caps like they got down here. I will give them this, though. It is very difficult to put the number of capacitors that they have for this amp design and fit it inside a standard size chassis. I mean, you'd almost need another amplifier to fit the amount of capacitance that they got, you know, stuffed into this thing. He's got another cap somewhere that you probably can't even see somewhere, but this is an absolute beautiful example. This is that 47 PF cap that I was talking about here that goes between the plates. You can play with that. You can see he opted to add it. He even put a bias, you know, tap circuit in here so you can check out the bias of your tubes. But this is just a beautiful build. This is how you should build your amps. That's all I can say. So in closing, this is the JCM-800, and I hope you learned a lot about why you love this amp so much, from the unfantastic input to the trippy, weird, and awesome cold clipper, to the the cathode follower that drives through the tone stack, that drives the freaking phase inverter into a singing glorious growl, that then drives the, multitude of different variants of tubes that you could have for the output section. EL34, KT77, 6550. I think there's even some models out there that use 6V6s now. I've even heard of some that use 6L6s. So there's a lot of different models that you can buy these days, but once you get all this thing singing, it's an amazing, amazing amplifier that definitely, started an era, if you will. So thank you so much for watching. I hope if you like this kind of stuff, click and subscribe. Let me know, leave a comment. Stay tuned. There's always more. Thank you so much. Goodbye.